Wendy Bacon, hi. Thank you so
Hi, Koo.
Hi. Thank you so much for agreeing to speak with me. Your story is incredibly interesting to me, and I'm sure a lot of my colleagues in our ethics class. Your story is one where you were denied admission to practice law in the early 1980s, which is almost 40 years ago. So I completely appreciate how difficult some of the facts might be to recall. However, the idea of this interview and the reason I was so interested in speaking with you was about the concept of being a fit and proper person, and that you were actually denied not necessarily on that alone or that in particular, but because of the fact of your involvement in the Sellers bail case.
Yeah, so I was, let me just clarify, they did find I wasn't a fit and proper person, therefore couldn't practice law. And the reason I wasn't a fit and proper person was because of the bail issue. That was the issue that they hung the judgment on.
Wonderful. So again, thanks so much for giving us your time today. So please just share a brief history of your case.
Well, I think to really tell the story of my case, I'd really have to go back to 1970 when I was a student editor. Now, this was at a time when there was very strict censorship, and we can't go into all of that, but one way or another, the newspaper that I was involved with, Saranka at UNSW, became involved in a lot of censorship battles, and I personally became involved in those too. And as a result of that, I was arrested and charged with various counts of publishing obscene publications. Sometimes one was selling it, another one would have been publishing it, and another one involved a protest in a court. Now, at that stage, I defended myself actually in court in two different trials, one in 1971 and one in 1972. Now, in those court cases, I took I think you could say, a very unorthodox approach. It was actually quite based in the law. I really argued that the obscenity law was based on a falsehood and an illusion, and really sort of took that to the jury and had, a certain amount of minor success with that, in that I wasn't in the end I was only convicted of one thing and not many others. So look, during this period, which I can't go into more, but during that, let's say 1970 to 72, I really became like I'd never been in a court till 1970. Once I got involved, I became very interested in the law, in the history of obscenity law, in the way the courts worked, and I discovered a lot of things. For example, one of the first times I was arrested, I was charged with using unseemly words, and when I went to court, basically the police just lied, straight out lied. So that was an early experience. And then because I was actually remanded in custody, I went to prison for 8 days on two different occasions. And that for me was a huge eye-opener. I came, like most students, I came, back then especially, I came from a relatively middle-class background. And, to even hear the stories of why women were in prison really changed my head a lot. I mean, that had a massive effect on me. Now, that interest in the law I sustained, and let's say that takes us to 1972. So then, in the intervening years between 72 and 77, I became very involved in feminism and in feminist law, and I actually became involved in Liverpool Women's Health Centre. I was a researcher there. I also did with another woman called Robin Lansdowne, who became a registrar at the Family Court. We did a study of female homicide offenders. So, I really extended my knowledge of the law. That last project was a little bit later. Now, in 1970, so I became interested in the law. I probably had no intention of practicing. And I think I always said that I didn't have an intention to practice, that, in 1977, I decided that it would be really good for me to get a law degree and extend my knowledge of the law and use it in my other work, both sort of activism work, because we'd done a huge amount with Women Behind Bars. Before the Royal Commission, there were women who were deaths in custody and Mulloway, things. Once you're involved with the world, legal issues come up all the time, actually, I've found. So in 1977, I decided to enroll in the graduate law course at UNSW. Now, I found it's really an interesting process, I think, because I found while doing the course, I sort of tended more to becoming more interested in practicing law. So I did the law course in 2.5 years.
Wow.
So mid-79, I was very near to finishing the law course. Now, during the time when I was doing law, quite a few more things happened in relation to protests and all that sort of thing. But I was probably in two minds until about mid-1979 when I decided I would apply to be a barrister. Now,
so you went to apply directly to be a barrister as opposed to a solicitor and then potentially.
Yes, so back then that was not uncommon.
Right.
There were less women barristers than there are now. There were no Supreme Court women judges back then. I certainly didn't imagine I would be a judge, but I thought I might be a barrister. And I also thought I would be more suited to being a barrister. So I applied and that was not unusual. Some people applied directly to the bar, some people go to this as a mission board, but my memory is it was basically the same process. So of course, by then I not only had my initial conviction back in 1970 and some very strong statements I've made about, more about, I guess I still would be in a position when I think unjust laws can be broken, can be morally broken. And I haven't changed from that, but probably once I wanted to practice law, I by then shifted to believing that, through the law, I could actually bring about change. And like many young lawyers do, that's not an unusual thing. But for me, it was a shift. And because I've been a fairly public person, it was a fairly obvious shift. And to tell you the truth, the absolute truth, when I've gone back, like now that I'm over 70, I'm 73, when you're younger, there seemed to be an awful lot of time between 1979 and 80 and the early 1970s. It seemed like a lifetime, 8 years. But now I'm 73 and I can look back, that's now 50 years ago to 1970. Really, that seems like quite a short period of time. And so I can see why it was a fairly rapid change and some people could have been quite skeptical.
Right.
But nevertheless, I did apply. Now, I was reasonably, all of my convictions, let's say, I think there were about 8. A couple of the other things I've been involved with, I was involved with, in 1973, in squatting in Victoria Street during the Green Ban period. And I wrote an obituary recently for Jack Mundy for The Guardian. So, I was very involved in that period. And then with some other women feminists and with some women who've been in prison, we formed Women Behind Bars. And during that period, we conducted campaigns, very big campaigns actually, for women who had been unjustly imprisoned. One was a woman called Sandra Wilson, and another one was Violet Roberts. That was a really huge campaign involving hundreds of people. But that had also led to, I'd also been arrested in that one, and I'd spent some days in prison for non-payment of fines. So, there was all these minor things. So altogether, none of them were for dishonesty. Right. None of them involved violence. So a minor. what you could say political style. I'd never been arrested for shoplifting or anything like that. So
You
I
just
was
answered my
really,
questions. That's exactly what I was going to ask you. Were any of these convictions for any kind of violent acts? Were any of these convictions for
no,
nothing like that? So they were mainly just activism and political
yes.
strikes and things like that.
They were all of that sort of thing. So I put in an application to the Barristers Admission Board and disclosed these things to them. I didn't actually have a copy of my police record initially, because that wasn't just something I could get that easily. And I got a letter back from them asking me for the full details of it all. So I supplied all of that. That process probably took a few months, I think, to actually get all that.
Were you nervous about that at all?
Oh, to say was I nervous? Look, I don't think that I ever got to the point, and I'm glad that I didn't, when I thought my only option or my happiness depended on being admitted to practice law. So I was very busy during this period. For example, I was working in the Attorney General's Department,
right,
as a criminologist on women and homicide. I was always doing some alternative journalism. And actually, by the time my case came up, I think I was working at Channel 9 full-time as a journalist. So I always had that other side, like a lot of people. Like there's a lot of people now, like David Marr, for example, very well-known journalist, now for The Guardian, has really a very illustrious career as a journalist, began as a lawyer. That crossover between journalism and law is not, I think, an unusual one. And also between social work, say, and law, or, there are sorts of people who can see a crossover. So I was definitely still one of those people. So I was nervous when the court case came, but I wouldn't say I was nervous in the early stages of the process. And lots of people were very encouraging. I knew lots of lawyers. They were encouraging other students who'd done law with me. So I wouldn't say I was really nervous. I really wanted it to be decided. And then they just sat on the case and nothing happened. And then eventually, so really it took a long time. We're talking now right through 1980, and it wasn't until 1981. So all this time I'm waiting and they won't make a decision.
When you say they, who do you mean?
I mean the Barristers Admission Board.
Okay.
Now the Barristers Admission Board then, I'm not sure now, consisted of a number of Supreme Court judges, most of them, I think. I think 2 representatives of the Barristers Admission Board and maybe an ex officio member of the Attorney General's Department. So eventually, every now and again, they had meetings. And in December 1980, they had a big meeting when they all just about turned up, bar the 3 who later sat on my case. The Chief Justice Street, he abstained. I don't know why exactly he abstained, but one day later on when I was working as a journalist, he rang me and kind of was quite embarrassed about the fact he hadn't stood up for me. So that was sort of odd. There was another one who was probably, I think, would have been on my side, but that was Samuels. And I think he abstained because he said he knew me. I didn't really feel I knew him, but that was fine. And I take it that the 2 for the Barristers Admission Board, the 2 barristers would have been against me because they later opposed my admission. So anyway, it was very close. It was 14 against and 10 for. So 10 people, including judges, said that I should be admitted.
Barrister.
So that's how, 10 of them believed I was fit and proper, and 14 didn't.
But
so it was clearly...
At the time when you initially applied to the Barristers Admission Board, they didn't give you a reason as to why.
No, they didn't give me any reason at all. So really all this was all about forcing me to go to court.
Okay.
That's what it was all about.
Why do you think
I think there was just a really big division between them.
Right.
There were letters written to the paper. There were signed statements by lawyers. Professor Sackville, for the dean of the law school, thought I should be admitted. So it was a very controversial thing. And of course, that controversial thing, although it wasn't really talked about a lot, was whether I was fit and proper.
Okay.
Now, a lot of that turned about whether people thought you could, say, be in a much more radical position to do with the legal system and then shift your position and say, I will respect the institutions of the court. And really, I mean, I've certainly been overtly critical of those institutions and certainly rejected the whole role of, I'd say in the obscenity law, I certainly challenged the role of the judge to explain the law. That's all in those earlier cases. But I just did have a lot of support to practice law.
And that was all. Sorry, so now we're at the point where you've been refused admission by the Barristers Admission Board. So now you go to the Supreme Court.
Well, then I either could challenge that decision and take it to the Supreme Court, or I could just go straight to the Supreme Court and ask them to admit me, like in a fresh application, ask them to declare I was a fit and proper person. And there were those two slightly different routes. So clearly I got legal advice. My lawyers were John Baston, who's now a very senior Supreme Court judge, and the other one was David Bennett, who became the Solicitor General during the Howard government.
And which route did you choose?
I went to the court and asked them to declare that I was a fit and proper person. And the Barristers Admission Board then said that they would oppose that and say that I wasn't. So it was going to be like a trial of my character. And at that point, that's sort of where it stood. So now this is where, so up until that point, it was really what was on the public record was really my convictions. It was all very clear. There were differences of opinion about that. Now, this is where the bail matter comes in, and that became very important. Now, and I'll just briefly describe what happened. During my course, as I said, I had defended myself. I also helped other people defend themselves in court. That was much more common then. There was a thing called a Mackenzie's friend case. It was a UK case. And later on, because I think some prisoners had a certain amount of success defending themselves, the courts really made that much harder. But this was a period when there was a lot of what people called Mackenzie's friends. And, I really enjoyed being in court, so I was prepared to do that. Now, there was a person called Steve Sellers. Now, this, looking back, and I would quite openly say, I think this was a pretty unusual thing to be doing, but Steve had been an important witness in an earlier police inquiry in Victoria into corruption in the Victorian Police Force. And I think his complaint, which I think was upheld by the Beach inquiry, was that he'd been thrown out of a window by the detectives in Victoria. So back then, you really have to understand, I think in understanding my case, that there was a huge amount of police corruption. Like in 1995, the Royal Commission into Police found that there was systemic lying. Police just lied in court, they planted guns, and that was my own experience. Like just routinely, police told lies. So I went into court, this was in the last month of my doing law, and one might ask, why wasn't I just being ultra careful? But nevertheless, there I was, and I helped Steve just by going through, providing a bit of advice on cross-examination, and he got off. So the jury acquitted him. The police were lying. So Steve then was in prison. I knew Steve. I didn't know him like super well, but I knew him and knew other people who knew him. And what happened is a barrister who was called Peter Livesey, who was himself later debarred over this,
yes,
rang me and asked me, due to Steve being extremely unwell, would I bail him out? Now, the honest truth is...
Can I just ask you, though, what I thought you said that he was found innocent? And
Oh, yeah, but he was in jail on other charges. Yes, so he was in jail on other charges.
Okay, so he was in jail on other charges. So now...
And my memory is, although I would have to check that he was acquitted. He was actually, like, he never was found guilty of the thing I bailed him out on.
Yes, and that was, I think there was a little bit of information that I found with regards to even the prison wasn't a proper... There was some kind of technicality on the prison as well. I'll send you that article. That
I think that they fabricated a record of interview when he was actually in a ventilator when it couldn't have happened or something like that.
Yeah,
That's
yes.
vague memory, but something happened with the actual case. So Steve's acquitted on one thing. He's still in custody.
Yes.
Peter Livesey was his barrister. He had very serious health problems. Now, I can again say this is, I think both Peter and I, and absolutely I had no idea that you couldn't bail someone out with money that wasn't your own. Like, as a regular thing, there were bail funds. There were bail funds. People put money in. You could get bailed out, or I bailed people out. And this whole thing about you could only be bailed out with your own money was just something that we were never taught in law school. I don't believe any lawyer had given it any thought, because lots of lawyers were involved in holding like some bail money, and then people would be bailed out. So this, to me, it might not have been the most sensible thing to be doing, but it was not something that I thought there was the slightest problem with from a legal point of view, because I would not have been doing it if I thought there was.
If there was a legal and ethical...
Yes, so I went with Peter. Right. Peter gave me the money. I bailed Steve out. Now, Steve, again, I had absolutely no knowledge of that. Steve did not go to appear in court. He claimed it was because he thought he was afraid of the police. He thought he could get killed. That was not off the cards, so he didn't appear in court. So the money was forfeited. Now, at a certain point during this whole period, I can't remember when, but someone said to me, someone who was in the legal profession at a very senior level wanted me to know that a detective called Roger Rogerson was raising questions about this bail issue, and that it could come up in the court case. And that was Roger Rogerson. That did come up in the court case. And of course, by the time I went to court, I was aware that that was a possibility. So I'd just like to say something about the actual court itself. The three judges, like these days, I think the composition of the court has changed quite a bit. But they were all men. I guess they were very conservative men, all in their 60s, I think. To me, they seemed old at the time. And when I walked into the court, I was actually wearing a skirt. I was wearing a suit. And Chester Porter was very, very nasty and sarcastic barrister, actually, although some people say he's actually a very good person. And he apparently later said he regretted this, but he sort of turned around and said, oh, she's deigned to wear a skirt. You know, it was just like so hostile. They were all openly hostile. And during the case, like every little skerrick of like they went and brought in every prison book where any prison I'd visited, you know, had I given the wrong address, you know, like they questioned me about how I got paid through the Attorney General's Department back then. people would be paid, you get a check and you just wasn't for that much, and you would actually, I didn't actually have a bank. I did have a bank account probably, but I would cash my check, I would pay my rent, I would live off that money, and then I would get paid again in a fortnight's time. It was absolutely not that unusual. But in the process of 2 days cross-examination, it certainly, I felt that they really were trying to make me out to be almost like someone who consorted with criminals. That was the whole idea. Like, for example, did I know a person called Jockey Smith? Well, I might have known him across a courtroom or something like that, but he was not someone I knew. But they were asking all these questions, creating this atmosphere as if I was a criminal myself, like right. An active professional criminal.
And Wendy, why it seems like from the articles that I've read that you've written about your experience, why do you think that they actually were trying to stop you from being admitted? Do you think that there was...
Oh, because of my political... No, I think because they were deeply offended by my original court cases, which were very well known and very debated. One of them involved wearing a nun's costume into a court.
Right. I did read that.
So, I had done things that were very... very critical, very right. confrontational, against very unjust laws. I'd raised a lot of things about corruption. There were no doubt that by that stage I was actually working at Channel 9 on major investigative stories about how the police were lying in court. The police hated me by that stage. I'd done a program on a killing in Chippendale of a person called Warren Lanfranchi. So I'd been actively involved as a journalist in those stories. So they had like many reasons why they didn't like me.
When you say they, do you mean
they meaning
establishment, the legal
police?
I'm sorry.
They meaning police.
The police?
There's more conservatives on the Barristers Admission Board. I mean, the Barristers Admission Board was a broad group of people.
Right.
There were many barristers there were plenty of barristers at that stage, defence barristers, who were raising the very same issues that I was raising.
Mm-hmm.
It was not that they were not well-known issues, but it was just very tense.
And do you think the judges had to do with that? Do you think that the judges were part of that they?
Oh, yes. Yes.
Okay.
Yeah,
so
absolutely.
Most of these were like...
one of them was Reynolds. Yeah, one of them was Reynolds, who I think was an ex-Crown prosecutor, who was very, very conservative.
Mm-hmm.
So I think I was a genuine affront to them. And I guess in the now as an older person, I can see that they would have been, and I did understand that at the time too, that I had been involved in a lot of things that threatened interests within the criminal justice system. Now, it's also true that it was, as it turns out, legally correct that you couldn't bail someone out with money that wasn't your own. But they never had any evidence, and I never, that the money was actually the proceeds of crime. Now, that would have been different. If I'd known that was proceeds of crime, well, then clearly, while I may not have addressed that aspect of the bail law particularly, obviously that is a real problem. Mm-hmm. But I had absolutely no knowledge of that at the time, and nor did the court, nor was the court able to show that. But they came to the conclusion that it was a conspiracy.
So in the end,
conspiracy law is itself very difficult area of the law, because you don't actually have to, it's sort of based on circumstantial evidence. Yep. This is all coming back to me now. So they formed the view that in the circumstances they found it was a conspiracy. So that was the judgment came out, and in a sense that was it. I mean, it wasn't completely it, because there was some consideration of an appeal, but I didn't think there was any, it was not like there was a legal issue to really go to the High Court. I once got later on, it might have been the following year, Lionel Murphy was then on the High Court, and his mate, Morgan Ryan, who was a solicitor, rang me and said, oh, you should appeal, and Lionel thinks you should appeal, and, but I by then I had really accepted it, decided to go on and be a full-time journalist. I was still at Channel 9. I later went to Fairfax and worked as an investigative journalist.
Well, I mean, Wendy, thank you so much. I mean, that is really quite a lovely in-depth an in-depth overview, if you will, about where you got to and why you were denied. But in the end, what they found was that you were not a proper person. So
that's right. Yeah.
So leading from that, and I find it interesting that judges and barristers are not elected officials, right? They're not elected officials, and so they're making judgments on who the public will be able to the public will be able to trust, right? So they're making those judgments. So you had already helped quite a lot of people when it came to civil disobedience cases and things like that. Did you continue to do that afterwards or not, as a non-lawyer?
Well, what's the best way of putting that? Yeah, well, look, one of the, first of all, I've never regretted. I'd like to say something about the fit and proper thing too.
Of course.
I'll just say something about that first.
Yeah, I definitely wanted to ask you about that.
Yeah, so I'd just say about the fit and proper issue, that clearly, a lot of these things are very subjective judgments. And I think that a fit and proper person should be one, and this is where obviously qualifications and training comes in, should be a person who's demonstrated to have the ability and the knowledge to practice law. That should be the basis of it, and it is. I mean, I think that that's correct. I think that there should be an acknowledgement that I very much still believe that there's an important role within the law for civil disobedience, and I think it should be accepted that in conscience people can break laws, and that should not be a barrier. And I think there probably is some sort of I haven't seen any judgment that actually accepted that, but I think that should be the case. I also think that people commit crimes when in some cases, when they've got mental health problems. And so, for example, if someone had been arrested for administering a drug or buying a drug when they're addicted in their youth, or even after their youth, I don't think that should be a barrier to someone being fit and proper. I think that if you get to that you probably do, like if you had a persistent history of theft, for example, and you actually had no regrets about that. Like, I think there also needs to be room and fit and proper for people to change, and to change their attitudes, and to change even their behaviour. So it should be at the time when someone applies, are they fit and proper? So now the other thing is, I think you've raised a very important issue of who should be the judges. Now, I'm not sure in that meeting of 24 people if there would have been one woman in that room. Now, it may be in my case that wasn't a particular thing, but I do think, and it was very true back then, that if a woman flouted conventional behaviour, the judgments passed on a woman, I think, were much more severe, perhaps than they are today, perhaps not. I'd maybe leave others to, or that's a bigger discussion. But, when I was younger and I'd done these quite outrageous things, in a way, I'd always be meeting people and they'd always be saying, but you seem really nice. And of course, I was always just the same. But it was because they had this image of this person, who would be like that. And that's what I meant by those judges. I think they had a figure in their mind, and they were hostile, and they just could not get. I don't think I had a chance, really. Once the bail thing did come up, and it was clearly a matter of judgment, what happened, whether they were not prepared to even consider, and yet it was the truth that I had no idea what I did was wrong, and no idea he was not going to go to prison, and and I did just take the money from, after all, a practicing barrister. So I think that the judges, it's really an interesting question about whether judges, whether it should just be legal people who select it, or whether judge fit and proper, or whether it should be a more open process involving the community. And so there should be more lay people involved who maybe can see it from a different point of view. So certainly there needed to be more diversity than there was back then, in my case, either the Barristers Admission Board itself or the court. And there was a lot of material. I think his name was Michael Sexton, who wrote a whole book at that stage about the narrowness of the legal profession. And John Baston used to do a course out at UNSW, and the textbook was called, I think, Law, Lawyers and Society. John's now in the Supreme Court. And that just, we in our education, our legal education, and probably people still do now, did a lot of sort of thinking about, there was a lot of radical critique of the legal profession going on. So that's another reason why they felt really under siege, the conservative part of the profession. So there was John, appearing for me, but they also were not that keen probably on him, so they're all big questions, but I think diversity is important. Back then, I think the first Aboriginal judge in New South Wales was Bob Blair, who did law at the same time as me. So it was just a very, very narrow scene, and I think it probably still is a pretty narrow scene in many ways.
Well, that's what I was going to ask you. Well, first of all, thank you for acknowledging all of those things, because one of the areas that I'm really interested in is this idea about who is the judge on who is a fit and proper person. And I really advocate for change in that capacity. And I think that the public should be more involved in the process of who they want representing them. So thank you.
Because I can say that in my own case, I think what would have made me a much better lawyer, I think there are challenges in this, but I think the fact is that I really did understand the legal system.
Right. And you really
I'd actually been in a cell. I'd been locked in a cell, and I was horrified the first time that happened to me, because it was really just a bit of wood and a blanket. But this is where people are, the situation in prisons, and it really worries me now that back then, it was a much more open process. There were far fewer people in prison. And there was much more, interestingly enough, a lot more court reporting. There was much more media scrutiny than there is now. And now I feel it's almost like this hidden world to me again, because I'm not so actively involved in that area anymore. It's almost like this hidden world of thousands of people. And, unless law students have an actual way of accessing that and sort of thinking about their own attitudes, I've come across, actually, coming back to your question about how did I continue to assist people? Well, for a long while, because I was working as a journalist, that became more my way of exposing injustice. And I had but I would say that I had some individual cases, and these are always they're always the stories that are much, much harder, because each individual injustice it takes months, sometimes months of work, certainly weeks of work, reading transcripts, and that's where legal knowledge, I would not say there is one day when I've been a journalist when my law degree has not come into it. Like, it's not been, even today I'm looking at a planning issue, and it's definitely easier because even though I'm very, very rusty on the law now, but I had that experience of reading documents. And I
Sure.
think that's a really good school. Now, my last big story that I did, mainly at Fairfax, was about a miscarriage of justice involving a woman called Roseanne Catt, who actually won her malicious prosecution case, having been 10 years in prison. Now, that was really interesting for me, because that really came about because after I became an academic teaching journalism and actually teaching media law too, but when I decided to do more freelance work, and this is about the year 2000, I sort of thought, well, what will I do a story about? And I chose to do it on, there was a thing at the time about a new women's prison. So I went back out to Malawa and I was there, and that's when I met Roseanne Catt. And that case took, years, maybe more than 10 years investigation. Now, of course, there was lawyers involved, there was major court case, but there's such a lack of journalists and lawyers who can tackle those individual injustice stories. Sometimes they're civil law stories, contract law stories, but lately I've been going through my papers, and sometimes I almost feel sick at the number of stories that I was not able to do and not able to get necessarily push people in the right direction. Even this week, I've had emails from people who've been really done over by the legal system, but where do they go? How do they get help? It's even harder now than it was then, because back then, I think Redfern Legal Centre was not absolutely overwhelmed to capacity. And now we do have more community legal centres, but I think they're really overwhelmed. And the other thing I'd also raise is that just in the number of journalism law students I taught, and some very, very wonderful students, but many of them would love to have gone out and used their law in really socially constructive ways and wanted to get jobs at community law centres, but they couldn't. They had to go and work for corporate firms, and some just gave up. They really did not enjoy that atmosphere. So, I don't know if it's easier or harder now, really. Different.
Everything that you say, I mean, I could talk with you for hours, because there's so many different things that you're bringing up, not just about being a fit and proper person, but about being an activist and potentially doing pro bono work and things like that, which are all issues that we're discussing in our ethics class. But I guess, just to kind of come back just very briefly right at the end with regards to this idea of being a fit and proper person. I mean, it has been 40 years since you were denied admission. And I know that you said that you don't think a lot of things have changed. But with regards to the openness of the court and the judges and the different associations that are allowed to admit us as solicitors and barristers, do you think anything has changed there? I mean, you're still an academic, you're a teacher, you've taught a lot of students. So it was pretty hard for you back then, but social norms have changed. We've got a lot more women in positions of power that are judges, perhaps not so many minorities yet, but things are changing. So do you think, as far as being a fit and proper person, that has become potentially a little bit more objective? Or
Look, I would hope so. I would hope so, because I do think, I mean, while it was not explicit in the judgment, and of course it's only my opinion, but I do feel that the sexism and the hostility and the prejudice might not be so great today, that there might have been, that they probably would have just accepted on the basis of my record that I would have been admitted as a barrister, and that would have been. Right. And one of the things I would just like to say is that I don't think that any person is like the perfect person to be a lawyer. But I think, and clearly, I would not want to argue that I was, but what I would say is I was probably a lot more suited and a lot more aware, and probably would have done a better job than many lawyers I've observed. Because even in recent years, when I was still doing the Roseanne Catt investigation, I observed some absolutely appalling communication behaviour from a particular male lawyer. And, you know, to the point, because this is relevant to ethics, so I'm there as a journalist, and then this lawyer who was a solicitor, as it happens, and it is a very senior solicitor, pulled me up in the street and absolutely badmouthed his client to me and said things that were outrageously wrong. Now, that is really unethical behaviour. Nothing happens about that sort of thing. It's really unethical not to take instructions, but I observed that also happen. So, you know, what I'm saying is I think there's quite a lot of unethical behaviour out there that doesn't get monitored, or clients feel really powerless. And I suppose what I'd really like to hope is that not just the diversity, because I think diversity is always an issue and always an important one to raise, but the quality of the communication between lawyers and their clients has improved over the years, but I don't feel very confident that it has. And I think there probably needs to be more emphasis on that, because one of the good things about the 1970s was it did really raise a lot of issues about power and powerless having a voice and all that sort of thing, which I think has provided a lot of groundwork for future reform over the decades, and still there, I know now, in law schools. But, you know, how it works out in the courts and in daily practice, I don't know. And I think also really for the the basis for an equal style legal system is equal access to the law. And then the second thing is to have the lawyers there to provide that access in a competent and ethical way. But unless you have an ethical system, unless you have equal access, well, all of that in some ways can become a lot of talk when there's bigger problems out there. You know, so I like that more structural approach to law reform, as well as just focused on the individual.
Wendy, thank you so much. I think you've just covered so many topics that we actually cover in our ethics class. Oh,
that's good. I'm glad I did. But can I raise one more point? Now I'm on a roll.
Yes.
Yeah, just one more point. The whole issue about activism and law is being a lawyer and being an activist is a really interesting one. I know you've dealt with that in another part of the course, and I just, knowing I was going to talk to you, I was thinking about it a bit more, and it's very similar to a lot of the issues too. Can you be a journalist and an activist? And I think one of the things, I think it sort of depends in a way in what position in the law you are. I think, for example, if you're a judge on the Supreme Court, I think it's probably very hard. You might write, you might make submissions, you might do things involved with legal, say environmental issues, but you probably won't go out and put yourself in the line of fire and get arrested or something in a protest. Now, if you were say, David Shoebridge is a barrister, but he's currently a member of the upper house. Now, he got arrested in the Extinction Rebellion protests. As a matter, you know, I don't think he went out there to get arrested, but he did get arrested, and he's defending himself. But no, he's probably got a lawyer, but I don't think that case has yet been resolved, or has it been? I'm not sure, but that raises, he's still a lawyer, but he's also an upper house MP. So I think, however, if you're working, say, in a refugee law centre and you're a lawyer, you may want to do everything you can to support people who are protesting, but probably you're going to be more effective if you focus on the legal aspects of it. And that's what I think too, you know, that's what I would have done if I'd gone into the law. I would have still been actively interested in politics, but it was all about trying to use those legal skills to assist people. And I've known people who've gone through like being very active lawyers. Say someone like John Baston is an interesting character to look at, actually, because he began as a barrister. I think he was probably a barrister. I know he was an academic from a very young age at UNSW, taught the ethics course at UNSW, was a barrister, became a full-on barrister doing a lot of banking, consumer law cases and that sort of thing, and is now on the Supreme Court. Now, John had many radical ideas. What his ideas are now, I don't know, because he is a judge. So once you become a judge, you become much more. And I think that's probably the only effective and right way to be a judge. You have to kind of cut yourself off a bit, I think. But other lawyers, I don't think so much. Anyway, that's a little bit of a rave on that issue. But I think it's quite a tricky one. I find it quite a tricky issue actually as a journalist as well. How far to get involved these days, because I'm retired, I'm a little bit more activist journalist than I was, say, when I was in the mainstream media. Oh, you're off.
There we go. Sorry. I was saying, hearing you speak so passionately about your activism and your advocacy work makes me a little sad that you actually didn't get it.
Oh.
But
I would have been glad. I nearly thought I might go back I used to say that I might go in my 80s. So I knew a guy called Bruce Miles, who used to shuffle around Dowling Street Court in slippers when I was down there a few years ago. He died, sadly. But look, actually, I think, as I have actually got like 73, I could maybe try to get admitted. But on the other hand, honestly, I would have to redo law. That is the sad truth. Probably. I've just got too out of touch. I'd have to go back and do it all again.
Well, you'd understand the principles of it, and you'd understand the process.
Yeah, I could very quickly get on top of criminal law.
If you decide to practice law again, I'm sure we'd love to have you at Macquarie University.
Oh, great.
So on that note, Wendy,
okay.
thank you so much for all of your help and in sharing your ideas about being a fit and proper person. That was my main intention for reaching out to you. So to hear your thoughts about that has been wonderful. Thank you so much. And I guess we will speak very soon.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Wendy, before you hang up.
Yeah.
Hi, I think I've just stopped the recording. So I just wanted to say thank you so much for everything. Once I finish my paper, I will send you a copy of it, and I'll send you a copy of the video. And whereabouts are you based?
I'm in Newtown. Whereabouts are you?
I'm in Narembeen. So I'm about 15 minutes from you. So once COVID is done, would you let me take you for coffee or afternoon tea? Or
that'd be great. Yeah,
would
definitely.
Love to do that, Wendy. I'll be in touch in June once I finish my paper.
Okay,
and
good luck to you, of course.
Thank you so much. I'll talk to you soon.
How many more subjects have you got?
I'm only doing 2 subjects this semester, just ethics and contracts. So I've got a week left of uni and then 2 weeks of exams.
Oh, great. Good luck. Actually, I really loved it. I thought law was a lot of fun, actually, in some ways.
Thanks again, Wendy. I'll talk to you very soon.
Okay. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.